On September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down over the Soviet Union, resulting in the deaths of all 269 passengers and crew. But why did this happen, and why had the plane veered so far off course? It's 1983, at the height of the Cold War. The relationship between the superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union is on a knife edge. The escalating tension was due to a number of factors: the Americans' Strategic Defense Initiative, its planned deployment of a new weapons system in Europe, and the US had just conducted the largest naval exercise held to date in the North Pacific. The Soviets viewed these developments as a threat, and believed President Ronald Reagan would launch a preemptive nuclear strike against them. The plane in question, a Boeing 747, was a scheduled flight from New York to Seoul, South Korea, via Anchorage, Alaska. On board were 246 passengers and 23 crew. After refueling at Anchorage, it departed on its final leg to Seoul at 4 a.m. local time. After takeoff, air traffic control instructed the flight crew to fly towards Bethel, Alaska, just 17 miles, 28 kilometers, from Soviet airspace. About 10 minutes after takeoff, the plane began to divert north of its assigned route, dangerously close to Soviet airspace. Within an hour, military radar tracked the plane at 12 nautical miles, 23 kilometers, off its intended route. In fact, the Korean jet had now traveled 160 nautical miles, 300 kilometers, off course by the time it reached the Kamchatka Peninsula. According to Soviet sources, Korean Airlines 007 entered the restricted airspace of Kamchatka at 6:51 local time. Earlier, when the plane was 130 kilometers from the peninsula's coast, 4 MiG-23 fighters had scrambled to intercept the Boeing. 10 days earlier, Arctic winds had knocked out the warning radar on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Rather than repair the radar, local officials instead lied to their superiors in Moscow, stating that yes, they had repaired the radar. Had the radar been operational, it would have enabled the plane to be intercepted a whole 2 hours earlier, giving the plane enough time to identify as a civilian aircraft. Instead, the unidentified airliner then crossed over the peninsula back into international airspace over the Sea of Okhotsk without being intercepted. By this time, Soviet air defense forces had been tracking the Boeing jet for more than an hour while it entered, then left, Soviet airspace. They now classified it as a military target when it re-entered their airspace over Sakhalin. 3 Su-15 fighters, in addition to the MiG-23s, were now dispatched to investigate. Due to the darkness, they could not positively identify it as civilian or military aircraft. The pilot of the lead fighter fired warning shots with its cannon, but recalled later in 1991, quote, "I fired 4 bursts, more than 200 rounds. For all the good it did. After all, I was loaded with armor-piercing shells, not incendiary shells. It's doubtful whether anyone could see them." The Boeing jet then contacted Tokyo Air Traffic Control, requesting clearance to climb in an attempt to save fuel. Once granted, the plane began its climb, which the Soviet pilot interpreted as an evasive maneuver. As the plane was about to leave Soviet airspace a second time, the order was given to shoot it down. The lead fighter fired 2 air-to-air missiles at the plane. In a 1991 interview with Izvestia, Major Gennady Osipovich, the pilot that shot the 747 down, spoke about his version of events. Contrary to official Soviet reports at the time, he recalled telling ground controllers that there were, quote, "blinking lights." He continued, quote, "I saw 2 rows of windows and knew that this was a Boeing. I knew this was a civilian plane. But for me, this meant nothing. It is easy to turn a civilian type of plane into one for military use." He added, quote, "I did not tell the ground that it was a Boeing-type plane, and they did not ask me." The Boeing quickly lowered their speed. They were flying at 400 kilometers an hour, 249 miles an hour. My speed was more than 400. I was simply unable to fly slower. In my opinion, the intruder's intentions were plain. If I did not want to go into a stall, I would be forced to overshoot them. That's exactly what happened. We had already flown over Sakhalin Island. It is narrow at that point. The target was about to get away. Then the ground controller gave the command, "Destroy the target." That was easy to say. But how? With shells? I had already expended 243 rounds. Ram it? I had always thought of that as poor taste. Ramming is the last resort. Just in case, I had already completed my turn and was coming down on top of him. Then I had an idea. I dropped below him about 2,000 meters. Afterburners, switched on the missiles, and brought the nose up sharply. Success! I have a lock-on. We shot down the plane legally. Later, we began to lie about small details. The plane was supposedly flying without running lights or strobe lights. Tracer bullets were fired, or that I had radio contact with them on the emergency frequency. The Boeing had been flying at 35,000 feet, or 11,000 meters, at the time of the attack. Tapes recovered from the cockpit voice recorder showed the flight crew had no idea they were over Soviet airspace, and off course. For 4 minutes after the missile strike, the plane descended until it leveled off at just over 16,000 feet. Analysis showed the flight crew maintained limited control for a further 5 minutes, then lost all control. The plane broke up, then spiraled into the ocean, just off the west coast of Sakhalin Island. Due to the Cold War tensions, Soviet search and rescue operations were not coordinated with those of the United States, South Korea, and Japan. No information was shared, and each side tried to obtain evidence that would implicate the other. The presence of Soviet warships in the area did not help matters. Within 6 days of the incident, the Soviets sent 6 ships to the general crash site. Additional ships were subsequently deployed to interfere with the recovery operations of their Western counterparts. Incidents included threatening to board a US-chartered Japanese vessel, interfering with a helicopter exiting the USS Elliott, attempting to ram a South Korean ship, near collision with the USS Callahan, and sending bombers equipped with nuclear air-to-surface missiles to threaten US naval units. The wreckage of the plane was eventually discovered at a depth of 174 meters, 571 feet, near Moneron Island. Since the aircraft had departed from US soil and contained US nationals, the National Transportation Safety Board was obligated to investigate. The investigation was later closed by the US State Department on the grounds that it was not in fact an accident. They instead pursued an investigation by the United Nations International Civilian Aviation Organization, a body that could only obtain information on a voluntary basis. The fact that the Soviets had recovered radar data, air traffic control transmissions, and the plane's black boxes, and kept them secret, effectively hamstrung the investigation. The ICAO released their report on December 2, 1983. It concluded that the violation of Soviet airspace was accidental. Attention was placed on the autopilot system of the Boeing 747, which has 4 basic control modes. Heading mode, which maintains a constant magnetic course selected by the pilot. VOR maintains the plane on a specific course transmitted from a VHF omnidirectional range. Instrument landing system, and INS, which keeps the plane on a pre-programmed flight path between several waypoints programmed into the computer. The report explained that Boeing's deviation into Soviet airspace was due to the autopilot remaining in heading mode instead of the pre-programmed INS mode after departing Anchorage. Either the crew failed to select INS mode manually, or this feature was not available as the plane was already too far off course. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian President Boris Yeltsin disclosed 5 top-secret memos dating a few weeks after the downing of Flight 007. Included were communications between the chief of the KGB and the defense minister to General Secretary Yuri Andropov, indicating they knew the location of the plane's wreckage, while at the same time pretending to search and also harassing the US Navy. They had found the cockpit voice recorder 50 days after the accident, and decided to keep this knowledge secret, as the information on the recording could not prove their assertion that the flight was on an intelligence mission. On a visit to South Korea on November 18, 1992, President Yeltsin released both the flight data and cockpit voice recorder data of Flight 007. A 90-foot memorial to the victims of the attack was erected on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, where some human remains and personal effects washed ashore after the attack.